Sorry. Doesn't that bring into like concerns of the gatekeeper? Like, if we're allowed to like edit the information that we're given from people, then really are we reflecting what they're really saying?
That's exactly the right question to ask. How much do you leave that open? The place that has got interesting thinking about this is the Holocaust Museum. So they had lots of poems about opening up their site at all. Does it just become a place for Holocaust deniers to vent? And on the official Holocaust Museum. And it's my impression that what they did is they said, this is open, but everything disappears after 2 weeks, or something like that. We're not keeping this, it's not official, it's not permanent, you can vent, but it's not there, it's not our official record. We don't want to keep this as a final. That's one way of saying it's open, but not ours. Everybody has to figure out the right balance there. There is some gatekeeping that will go on. I don't think it's just wide open. Wikipedia has sort of self-appointed gatekeepers. And for some topics, closes it down even more. There's a whole range of possibilities. It's to be figured out, I guess. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any new movements in ways of sharing real objects, artifacts between museums that either have too much or can't, or filled or whatever, but you don't want things just to be deaccessioned and lost in ways. Is there any value to some kind of...
The John Nicholas Brown Center is the home of something called the Museum Loan Network, which was a group set up, I shouldn't speak about it in the past tense, it's still around, but it's on the way out in some ways. Museum Loan Network was set up roughly a decade ago, and the idea was to do exactly this, to facilitate lending of objects between museums. And early in its life, it had a lot of money to help with shipping objects around, with cataloging in ways that would be useful. And several hundred museums put significant collections on there in a way that is basically saying, these are things that we have available for long-term loan.
Craigslist.
It was Craigslist, right, but it was done before some of the modern technology, before museums had their objects online. And so in some ways it's lived, it's past its usefulness because there are other ways now of finding out what objects museums have. There are equivalent to Craigslist, the Park Service, for instance, when it deaccessions things. It has a big file that you can go to and find out what they're getting rid of. More and more museums, all the Canadian museums are networks. It's called CINCH, the Canadian Network something or other. Network Cultural Heritage. I forget what the I stands for. And they have figured out a way to join all of their museums together. It is one of the, with my director of the museum hat on, one of the most infuriating things I've worked on lately is trying to get museum collections online in a useful way. It's really hard. Museum computer databases are still a little bit of black magic. And you would think that there would be interchange systems. So the library world has figured this out a long time ago. The libraries, you go to OCLC, every library in the country, maybe in the world is there. They know how to do this. Museums are way behind the times in this networking of collections. Every few years there's another attempt. OCLC actually tried in museums for a little while. They had museum objects. I have not heard about that experiment lately. The folks at the Center for History and New Media down at George Mason University have come up with what they're calling Omeka Commons. Omeka is their cataloging project, and the idea is there'll be a sharing system as part of that. I wish them well. Cataloging museum objects is still an art, and how to share things in a useful way turns out to be really hard. And to go back to your earlier question about Philadelphia and how museums work together, one could imagine a union catalog in Philadelphia that had all of the material, using either the same cataloging system or one that a variety of systems that could talk to each other. There's a plan afoot now for university art museums in the Northeast to do some sort of interchange like that. Other thing, I should say, going back to Philadelphia, the people from outside Philadelphia look at Philadelphia, you look, and everyone says, ooh, Pew Charitable Trust is there. They do all the neat stuff. They have all the money. So in some ways, that's one of the things that's helped to lead Philadelphia. So it could be a model for doing that kind of thing. Yeah.
So librarians figured it out, and they're lucky enough with their catalog materials to have title pages, which are summaries that started out on the right foot, and museum objects don't have anything like that. In between the two, you have archivists or archives, which are objects, but they don't often have that kind of title page advantage. So is there something to learn from the archivist community?
I think museums can learn a lot from libraries and archivists. From the museum curator's point of view, it looks to me like both librarians and archivists have figured this out. They have a system. Like you say, libraries have the advantage that books have title pages, but they also have Library of Congress coming up with an agreed upon set of terms that you use to catalog books. Archivists have figured out a system. Lately, the encoded archival descriptions, they have an interchange system for what's in an archive. And they can share that, encoded archival descriptions. Museums haven't got anything like that. It would be nice, and it should happen. The place that's trying to do this is the Getty with its thesaurus, but mostly museum people just shake their head when you mention that.
I'm wondering, part of the problem with sharing, with these sharing databases is that museums sometimes don't want to share.
I get this from my curator says, be sure you know that there's lots of confidential material in that database. You really don't want to let that out. And there is some material about donors or values or whatever that in fact is confidential and you want to keep secret. There is some material though that curators don't want to share, but maybe museums should share. This was a problem with the Smithsonian where, because its dual nature as a museum and research institution, you have curators who have been working on a book for a decade based on a collection, and they don't want that collection out there in the public. And I'm sympathetic a little bit, but these are public institutions, and the first goal is to share things. So curators sometimes need to be encouraged to share things that is not their first inclination. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking that the biggest problem you've got between comparing libraries and museums is that libraries ultimately have a much greater flexibility in replenishing their collections. Books are much more easily accessible. They're, a book is going to be printed much more than once. If you have an artifact, it's going to be rare. Oftentimes, if it's in a museum, it's rare or unique even. So what do you think of that issue?
It's a real problem. The places that have done well by doing this sharing across museum collections, in fact, are the kinds of objects that there are many of. So the OCLC did this test case with for medical museums. Turns out medical museums mostly have the same stuff, and that you can do a library-like cataloging. So there are some categories of museum things that you can catalog library things. There are lots of unique things in museums, which is what makes them special, but there still should be interchange standards for maker, materials, categories of objects. It will never be as easy as libraries, you're right. But it's sort of a model maybe to think about is what could you do? Same thing with digitization. Libraries, it turns out it wasn't that expensive, $100 million or so. You could digitize everything that's out there in libraries. Museums, unlikely will ever do that. Archives, even, just like that, it's just required. So, but I guess all of these fields can learn from each other. That's really what I'm saying. What can we learn from what libraries have done well? What can we learn from what archives have done well? Yes.
Conversely, what lessons do you think archives in particular could take from museums?
That's a good question. I guess, and I'm no expert in archives, so I should preface what I say with that. I think archives can do better with the public. That archives can make material available in ways that museums sort of take for granted, that our goal is, we've got a collection, we figure out a way to display it, we figure out a way to tell a story with it. Archives have focused pretty completely on the academic researcher or the researcher. The model that's so interesting in archives, and it's a model that makes archivists unhappy, is the footnote.com model. Footnote.com has digitized 60 or 70 million pages out of the National Archives. And they've done this in all the ways that archivists don't like. They've cherry-picked it, they've taken the ones that, there's lots of, I understand there's lots of concern. But on the other hand, they've made 60 or 70 million pages available online in a way that can take advantage of crowdsourcing. So, do you want to transcribe this document because it's good for your genealogical research? You transcribe it and you put it available online for other people to look at. Take a look at their website. It's sort of fascinating to see how an archival project aimed not at researchers but at the general public thinks differently about what they do. So you can't quite favorite somebody or become a fan of somebody, but you can say, I'm related as a category of ways of dealing with an archival document and with a line in an archive. And suddenly you find, you build a community around the document. So maybe they'll put a Facebook page for every archival document too. But what I think archives can get from museums is a sense of thinking about the public as part of their work.